My goodness. That was probably the worst introduction I've ever had in my life. But I love that boy, and I love you all for loving my children. Sherry and I cannot tell you what it means to walk into these doors. From a decade ago, when we left, I was thinking when we walked in, Adam, that it was about this time of year 10 years ago that we were discussing what it would be like to have a third century in ministry. And the church council met that night, and we were beginning to dream about what that would look like here. And on my way home, the bishop from the Tennessee conference called and said, would you like to come home to Nashville? And I said, no. I'm very happy where I am. And we said no. And then, as I always say, I made the mistake of praying about it. And you know how that goes with plan B. God laughs at plan A. And then, so we've been in Brentwood. It was a homecoming for us because I grew up in Nashville. But coming to Lawrenceville is coming home for Sherry and me. And particularly to be with your pastor, who I dearly love and speak to once or twice a month about ministry and what's happening. And I want to say a special word to the youth that are here. First of all, it's cool that y'all are sitting on the first 3 rows. That's really cool. And all over the place, too. But one of the things that I love about this church is its youth ministry. And Brent was so strategic in his ministry here with youth. And then we just had one after the other. But it wasn't just the staff. It was primarily the counselors that we had that our kids remember the best. It was like, we always thought, they always used to teach you that you need 1 counselor for every 5 youth. I think we had 5 counselors for every 1 youth because we put the very best leadership that we had, spiritual leadership, downstairs in that youth department. And so as a result of that, God has called really hundreds of young people into the world as adults. To lead others to Jesus. And Sherry and I are the recipients of that. Sherry, where are you? Raise your hand. So you're in the back. How did you get that seat? Oh my gosh, those seats go so fast. So our daughter is a therapist, and she lives in Clarksville, Georgia. We have 1 grandchild, and I have a picture of Crosby. I want you to see Crosby. Can you see him here? We think he's going to be a preacher, don't you? I'm not sure if he's praying or trying to keep his eyes from being licked by the dog. That's our grand dog, whose name is Cash, named after Johnny. He's a coonhound, and we're somewhat proud of him sometimes. At any rate, our son, of course, is at LVfirst. We had the privilege last week of hearing Andrew preach, and then we drove to Clarksville, where I watched our 2nd Super Bowl with our grandson, Crosby. That's our thing together. He's 15 months, and we were both for the Chiefs. He doesn't know it, but I do. And so we had that time together. Adam, it is such a privilege to be with you and to sit at your feet. Logan, thank you for the music, and all of you who are here. You are our family. We know some of you, and some of you are new to us, but you're our family. And to have raised our children with you means the world to us. Thank you for the invitation. I want to say a word about Adam. We have bought a little cabin up in Cleveland, Georgia, where we intend to retire someday, and it's 15 minutes from Crosby. That's why we call it the nursery. It's not the cabin, it's the nursery. And we bought it because of Crosby, and plus it's safe distance for our son-in-law. We're not trying to intimidate him, but 15 minutes away. So we came a few weeks ago, and when we walked into our cabin, on the dresser across from our bed was this picture. And I mean, it's rather shocking when you walk into your cabin and you're about ready to go to bed and you see this guy. So we were terrified at first. Like, your pastor is a thief. He has broken into our house. And then it came to our attention that he didn't work alone. People never do. Thieves never do. He worked with one of your trustees in your church, whose name I will not mention, but her initials are Cindy Collins. Anyway, so these two went up to Cleveland and planted his portrait right across from where we sleep at night. And so I called this particular trustee whose name I will not mention, and I said, I don't think I can go to sleep with him looking at me. And she said, why not? We do it every Sunday. Just kidding. Oh man, y'all are so blessed, and you know you are. Thank God for Adam Hildebrandt and Michelle and their family for their presence and for their ministry. They're amazing, amazing, amazing people, as are you. I want to read a scripture you may think is a little odd today, but I've thought about this for a long time, and I've got about 15 minutes to share with you, I think. 15, maybe 20 minutes if I push a little bit. This is from Genesis 47, and I'm going to read these words. This is verses 27 through 30. You'll think it's odd. I hope you won't think that when I'm through. Out of reverence for God, I invite you to stand for the reading. Your friends, hear the word of the living God. Now Jacob, who was also renamed Israel, which means one who struggles with God and perseveres. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they settled in it, had many kids, and became numerous. After Jacob had lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, and after he had lived a total of 147 years, Jacob's death came near. And he summoned his son Joseph and said to him, Joseph, if you would be so kind, lay your hand under my thigh, which is a symbol of an oath-keeping or oath-making, and be loyal and true to me. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my fathers, I want you to carry my bones from Egypt and bury me in Canaan, in the land to which God is leading you. And Joseph said, okay, I will do as you have said. And Jacob worshiped as he leaned on his bedpost. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Now I know what you're thinking. Yeah, that's a bizarre text, especially for today. I mean, of all days, we're celebrating a bicentennial. And to be honest with you, I'm not preaching a warmed-over sermon today. I've never preached on this text, and I'm questioning now whether or not I should have. I'd done a series on Genesis a couple of years ago called The Human Purpose, and you know the word Genesis means, in Hebrew, it's Bereshith, which means beginning, because the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are all named after the first words in those texts. The beginning, in the beginning, Bereshith. That's what Genesis means. It's the first book of the Torah. It narrates 2 things, the primeval history of the world and the family history, the patriarchal history of the Israelite people. But when I was preaching that series, Adam, I didn't go past chapter 45. But as I thought about today and prayed about today, I found myself going to this particular text. It got my attention for some reason when I thought of you. It's a deathbed scene, this is odd, where Jacob, also named Israel, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham that it all started with, is now facing his last days. He's planning his own funeral. He's made up the bulletin, he's picked out the songs, the hymns, the scriptures, and now, laying in his bed, he's contemplating his final resting place. And he calls his fair-haired son, his favorite son, Joseph. When it comes my time, he says to his son, I want you to carry my bones out of Egypt, and I want to be interred in Canaan, the land of promise, to which God is calling us. That's interesting that son Joseph later in chapter 50, the last chapter, he essentially does the same thing. He's in hospice in chapter 50. The doctor calls in the family, and he too says, I'm coming near my end, and someday God will come and deliver you out of the land, into the land that he has promised, that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when he does, I want you to promise me that you'll carry my bones with you. into the promised land. Now, it's interesting because neither old man, neither patriarch wants to be left behind in Egypt. I discovered that rabbinic commentaries suggest that Jacob and Joseph's biggest fear was that their descendants might forget them. And worse than that the children of Isaac might forget where they came from and to whom they belong. This is a text that is made for today. It's about identity. Remember who you are. Isn't it interesting how critical memory is to our faith? It's absolutely critical. The word is zakar in the Hebrew. You find it over and over and over again in the Old and New Testament. In fact, I could quote from the Bible 100 times. Remember the rock from which you're hewn. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. Jesus, one night, Maundy Thursday, took bread, broke it, gave his disciples, and said what? Do this in remembrance of me. A dying thief on the cross. Jesus, remember me. When we forget who we are and where we've come from, when we disremember, we become dismembered from community, from our identity, from our heritage, and from our purpose. It was Freddie Buechner who said, to remember the past is to see that we are here today because of grace, and we have survived as a gift of God. I want you to carry my bones. When my father died, I was pastor here. This was 2004, and there must have been 30 of you that drove all the way to Nashville to be a part of that service. When he died 19 years ago, he gave his body to Vanderbilt, to the medical school there, because he wanted every ounce of his being to be of benefit for the good of others. When we received his ashes, it was at least a year and a half later, we had his interment at Woodlawn Cemetery, which is about a mile from where I grew up, where my mother still lives, 10 minutes from the church that we serve. And we put his cremains in a stone bench that bears his name. My mother will one day go there too. And the bench faces the chapel, a little chapel, where my dad performed literally hundreds of funerals. And every now and then, sometimes on Saturday, I'll go over and I'll sit on that bench just to remember. I remember when I was a teenager, when I would leave home, my dad would say something that would annoy me every time I would leave. He would say, son, remember who you are. It was sometimes the last thing I wanted to hear. Remember whose you are. And every now and then I go over and sit on that bench just to remember. His ashes are in the bench, but I'm carrying his bones. You remember the prodigal son? You remember his problem? He forgot who he was. I love that story of how he came to his dad one day with this bizarre request. He said, Dad, I want what's coming to me after you die. In other words, he was dissing his dad. He was saying, Dad, you're worth more to me dead than alive. And his dad consented, and you remember the story. The boy took off for a far country, which is a parochialism for saying Gentile territory. And when he ran out of money, he ran out of friends. And he wound up in a pig farm, unkosher. That's about as low as a Jewish boy can go and still be alive. He's working for Bob Evans. But you remember what brought him home? Memory. When he remembered his father, he came back to himself. I want to tell you something you already know. The longest trip you'll ever make is to come back to yourself. Your heritage, your identity. Remember who you are. That boy ran away from home, but his heritage caught up with him, and it brought him back to the Father. It's in his bones. It's in your bones. A few years ago, Sherry and I took a group to England. A group from Brentwood wanted to study Wesleyan heritage, Wesleyan history, and we went to Aldersgate where Wesley's heart was strangely warm. That was a treat. We went to Bristol, the New Room. We went to Oxford where the man studied at Oxford University. But my favorite place, our favorite place, we went to St. Andrew's Church in Epworth. It was in Epworth that his father Samuel had been the pastor. It was in Epworth, you remember, where little John, they called him Jackie, at the age of 5, was rescued as a brand from the burning out of the parsonage. And it was there that he would return at the age of 40 to preach. And you remember the story when he came back to St. Andrew's, to his dad's church. His dad was long gone. In fact, his dad's grave was in the cemetery. And because of the controversy that was around John Wesley, he was too enthusiastic for the Anglican church. They wouldn't let him in the pulpit. And so he went out into the cemetery and he stood on his father's grave. And he proclaimed the unsearchable riches of Jesus and his love. And historians say on that Sunday, there were more congregants out in the graveyard than there were in the sanctuary, because the man was preaching the gospel. He stood on his father's bones. And that cemetery came to life. You know, carrying bones is not just about remembering the past, although that's what today is about in many ways. But carrying bones is about embracing the promised future, too. It's fascinating to me that years later, Jewish midrash, Jewish rabbinical commentary would say 400 years later that while the Hebrew slaves were packing to leave Egypt during the Exodus, that Moses was searching for Joseph's bones so that the Exodus would unfold exactly as was promised. After all, Joseph foretold their deliverance, and it happened, just like he said. Those bones were a sign of God's faithfulness. Those bones were a reminder that when God makes a promise, he doesn't renege on it, he delivers. In other words, God puts God's DNA into our very being and enables us to live out our calling, to remember who we are. I don't know if you know about it, but you're carrying some bones with you this morning. When we served here between 01 and 13, we came here in 2001, June, and then 9/11 hit. 2001. I think it was during that time that we formed a deeper bond in this community. One of the things I appreciate so much about you all is that you allowed me to go back and do my doctoral work at Southern Methodist University. It took me 5 years. I was digging up bones the other day in an old box, and I came across my dissertation, Adam. And it was about the work that we were doing at that time of birthing a church. You remember that? And I was writing my dissertation on the impact on Lawrenceville Church of planting a church. And in that thesis, in chapter 2, I apparently had exhumed our past, and I found out our story. In 1823, in the backwoods of northeast Georgia, Methodist circuit riders came here and established an outpost for the gospel. It was the very first Methodist mission in this county. The county, as you know, was named for one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Button Gwinnett, who himself was a PK and a scoundrel, which is often the case. In 1823, this church was planted here. 38 years later, the shots rang out between North and South, and the nation was split in two, divided. While the men went to battle, the women kept the church going. This is our story. These are our bones. These women in the Civil War stayed home. They were the matriarchs who found resilience here in this place, as do we. They came here to do what we're doing today. They came here to praise. They came here to pray. They came here to confess, to teach, to preach, to disciple their young. And they found their identity not in geography nor in politics. They found out who they were in Christ. I call them steel magnolias. And God used those women to weave into this body a maternal instinct that still shapes this family in mission and in witness. As the chief caregiver in Gwinnett County, you still are. And we're carrying their bones. Can you imagine what this church has seen in 2 centuries? Through civil war, through Reconstruction, through the influenza epidemic of 1918, through the Great Depression, through 2 world wars, through the Korean conflict, through the Vietnam War, through women's suffrage and civil rights, through countless recessions, through worship wars, and worst of all, the screen. Is anyone old enough to remember the controversy of the screen? Through theological schism, ecclesial division, political polarization, the church has endured. Through 9/11 and COVID, these bones are still alive and well because this house was built on a foundation. This house is standing today on 2 pillars: the great commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, and the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples. What I'm telling you is, if you don't know, you got good bones. One more thing and I'm through. That's the only thing the guy got right in my introduction. The truth is, we're all writing our eulogy by the way that we live. We are. We're picking our hymns. We're picking our scriptures. We're picking our eulogist. And the truth is, a faithful past will lead to a faithful present, will lead to a faithful future. No bones about it. One of my mentors, Charles Farr, some of you remember him. He was pastor here when the sanctuary was built. He was here, I think, 6 or 8 years. He took in the 1,000th member of this church when he was here. He and Julie, his wife, retired here, and their presence was a strength to us, still is. In fact, I remember when they joined the church, Julie leaned over and said, "Pastor, this is the first church I've ever joined by choice." She always had to join because of Charles. Before we left for Nashville a decade ago, Charles asked if I would come back and do his funeral when the time came. And I said, "Well, that's really up to the pastor." And he said, "No, it's up to me." And I said, "Okay." And he gave me a packet and said, "Don't open this until you get the call." I said, "Yes, sir." When Amy and Jeff called 5 years ago, I went to my office and opened the top drawer and pulled out that folder. It was still sealed. And one of the things I found in that old packet was an old bulletin from Lawrenceville First Church from a Maundy Thursday service where we had gathered one evening to remember how Jesus washed our feet and gave bread and cup as a symbol of his love and sacrifice for us. In that bulletin, Charles had circled the last verse of a hymn that we sang that night, and this is the verse. "What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever. And should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee." And beneath the lyrics, he had scribbled his epitaph. "Davis, tell the people I never did outlive my love for Jesus." I hope you never do. I hope I never do. Been 5 years since that day, but I want you to know I'm still carrying that man's bones. And you are too. And my prayer for you, church, is that as you begin a 3rd century, my goodness, is that you will continue to build on the rock that the gates of hell cannot prevail against, and that your bones would be worthy of someone else carrying to the next generation.